Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third session of our collaborative film program with the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive, titled Decolonizing African Cinema, A History. For those of you attending this program for the first time, it is a month-long program divided into 4 weeks, with films made available to screen through the Africa Institute's website, starting 3 days before each week's webinar session. Today's session is titled Historicizing the Decolonizing Principle and will be moderated by Bakr Sanogo, Associate Professor in Film Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. 2 films were made available for screening as part of this week's session: Battle of Algiers, directed by Guido Pontecorvo, and Camp de Ator, directed by Tierno Fatih Sao and Usman Samben. The webinar will last for 1.5 hours. The format will include a 10 to 15 minute presentation by each guest speaker before turning into a discussion. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So for everyone attending, please write your questions in the Q&A section and we hope to answer all of them. I'll pass it on to my colleague Imru Bakari to say a few words and introduce the moderator, Abu Bakr. Thank you.
Thank you, Satan. And welcome again, those of you who are joining us for this webinar, this session. If you've been on the previous 1 or 2, welcome again. Those of you who are joining for the first time, we hope to see you on the next and last one, which we'll speak about towards the end of this session. This series is entitled Decolonizing African Cinema, A History. And I'm speaking on behalf at the moment of the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive. And my name is Imru Bakari. June Giovanni will join us in a few minutes. This program, this series of webinars is in collaboration with the Africa Institute in Sharjah, represented by Satan Al-Hassan, and of course the staff at the Institute, Reem El-Badawi, one of our principal point people and very supportive persons in this operation. This webinar of 4 discussions aims to reconsider the factors that have shaped the foundations of African cinema and its ideas about cinema, and to situate the seminal works of African cinema in relation to contemporary films, equally in relation to the trends, the tendencies, which have defined debates and critical ideas around this cinema. The purpose, of course, is that we will focus, and we have been focusing on a theme which is being explored by a number of participants with a moderator whom I will introduce in a few minutes. And as Satan has said, there are complementary films associated with each webinar, including the one today. There is also a list of recommended films, and I will post those in the chat box for your reference, but you can also find them listed on the web page. These symposiums, as I would say on behalf of the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive, are aimed at a wide and diverse audience, but we give a special consideration to students of African cinema. And in this regard, we note the lack of knowledge and resources for the study of African cinema in Africa and as a whole. With the overall aims of the program, there is also the recognized need for reframing contemporary debates with a view to opening up the field to new perspectives, which are indeed prioritized around pertinent issues or issues that are pertinent to the African cultural economy and indeed its futures. Reem has already given you an outline of the format of the session, which would be the moderator will be introduced. He would then introduce the discussants. They will make a presentation of about 10 minutes and then they will have a discussion. In the first webinar, which was 2 weeks ago, we discussed foundations of African cinema. In last week's session, we discussed cinema cultures in Africa. And in this session, we are discussing, or the title of the discussion is Historicizing the Decolonizing Principle. and is moderated by Bakr Sanogo. The aim of the discussion is to explore the significance of African cinema and its historical emergence in relation to, in its broadest sense, three factors: the personal and professional experiences of the panelists; two, an understanding of the ideas and aspirations that are associated with the pioneers of African cinema; and three, how African cinema and its legacies may be understood and valued from the perspective of the diverse audiences across Africa and within the various diaspora communities. I would like to, at this moment, introduce Bakr Sanogo, who will then in turn introduce today's panelists. Bakr Sanogo is an associate professor in film studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He is cross-appointed with the Institute of African Studies and the Institute of Comparative Studies in Literature, Art, and Culture, and the Curatorial Studies program. His writings have appeared in a number of film and cinema journals, and he is currently completing 2 manuscripts on the history of documentary in Africa and on the cinema of Medhondo, as well, which will be, in fact, an anthology on this legendary, in fact, pioneer of African cinema. Sanogo has also curated film programs for the Smithsonian Institute, the Toronto International Film Festival, and Il Cinema Retrovato Film Festival in Bologna, and the Pan-African Film and Television Festival of Ouagadougou, known as FESPACO. He is the founder of the annual African Film Festival of Ottawa, presented in partnership with the Canadian Film Institute. He is also the North American Regional Secretary for the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers, FEPASI. And in this regard, as well as his work within FEPASI, he initiated and oversees now the FEPASI Archival Project. In that capacity, he has been instrumental in establishing the Africa Film Heritage Project, a major film preservation and restoration initiative in partnership with Martin Scorsese's The Film Foundation and UNESCO. And it's, as a great friend and a great colleague, it's my pleasure to introduce Bakr Sanogo, who will then take over the discussion from this moment onward. Thank you. Bakr.
Thank you so much, Imru. Thank you to the Charter Institute for inviting us. Thank you to the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive for initiating the invitation. Thank you, Keith. Mahan, it's a great pleasure for me to be in your company for the next hour and a half to discuss issues that matter to all of us in a major way. When I received the prompt from Imru to take part in this event, in particular, the way he formulated and articulated the objectives of the seminar, I couldn't help but think about one thing. It is that, in effect, to a large extent, African cinema was actually born in a highly intellectual and theoretical context, actually, when you think about it, in the age of decolonization. The founding fathers of African cinema did not simply almost invent the project of African cinema. They were fellow travelers of a group of intellectuals, in fact, who are all concerned with ending the colonial project on the African continent and, in fact, imagining a new Africa, an independent Africa, a radically transformed Africa, and so on. And so when I heard the question of historicizing the decolonial idea, I couldn't help but go back to that moment And that moment for me is what I would refer to as the Présence Africaine moment. I think it's important to really highlight this because those were the companions of our filmmakers, or people like Semben, Poulain Vieira, Timite Basori, Sarah Maldoror, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Now, what were these guys trying to do? They were trying, in effect, to world, it was a sort of worlding project through an African and an Afro-diasporic project. They were taking on the debate around a civilizational project. They were taking on the very question of the place of Africa in the world. And that happened at a multiplicity of levels. From a historical standpoint, for example, they felt that the history of Africa had to be rewritten because it had primarily been, let's say, deformed by the colonial project. And so among some of the fellow travelers who really insisted on the question of the historical, one could identify at least two who would end up, in fact, initiating what we call the General History of Africa project. These two figures are Cheikh Anta Diop of Senegal and Joseph Kizerbo of Burkina Faso. They would really, really work toward reimagining and rewriting, in effect, the history of the continent by, in fact, bringing forth a certain number of truisms, which include the fact that Africa was the cradle of humanity, that was the continent where the human being, in fact, was born, crawled, walked, thought, loved, created habitation for themselves, created culture, created civilization, created literature, created mathematics, created philosophy, created ways of being human in effect, right? Which obviously would end up inspiring other culture. This was a radical, it's a truism, but in the colonial context, a radical proposition, obviously, that would end up nourishing many, many of the filmmakers that we would be talking about today. Among them were also the people who were concerned about what kind of Africa would we create in the wake of decolonization. And you know, many of you know some of these figures, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Léopold Senghor, and many, many, many others who are still with us today as theoretical companions who help us think through our times, even as we speak today, but also, of course, think through African cinema in many, many ways. And so, so this question of historicizing the decolonial must, it seems to me, start somewhere around that period where a set of ideas that would put forward around the destiny and the becoming of Africa included now what kind of cinematic becoming for the African continent, obviously. And that becoming, of course, is what people like Semben and Vieira and Basori and Sarah Maldoror and many others were interested in. And so it's important to say that because one could argue that a number of ideas and, let's say, gestures around African cinema that came into being in the process. Those include, for example, the notion of African cinema as something like a critical consciousness for the African continent. The idea that African cinema should participate in really in sort of creating a critical tradition in the continent that would both be celebratory, obviously, of the history and all that stuff, but also be highly critical of the limitations and the failures of the decolonization process, as it were. So a lot of ideas came into being. Issues of engagement, issues of indocility, issues of maroonage, issues of the provisional image. Others including the idea that how do we imagine the transformation of the African continent in cinematic terms? Should transformation come from outside or from inside, for example? What kind of uses for cinema? We've had a number of ideas and concepts. The cinema as an evening school, the filmmaker as a greer of the screen. You all know that. The cinema as having its finger on the pulse of the time. The cinema as imagining futures for Africa. The filmmaker not being necessarily in relationship to what we consider the spectator, but really the spectator, the people as spectator, or the spectator as people. And these are not really exactly the same categories. Within it, obviously, multiple movements and counter movements, which were created precisely around battles about how best to achieve the existence of an African cinema. And so you had, obviously, we can call the Sembenian School, we can say the Green Eye Collective, the Mambeti School, which is coming way after the Sembenian School, the Guild of African Filmmakers, some new moments, including, let's say, the emergence of the popular tradition, including Nollywood in this particular case. And right now, of course, among other things, the question of the transmission of the African film heritage. And so in many ways, this 50s, late 50s moment really shaped that question of the role of the artist in the transformation of the polity. The role of the artist as a vanguard, as being at the vanguard of the social. And obviously the imperative of really looking toward completing the unfinished project of decolonization. And so a multiplicity of ideas, multiplicity of filmmaking, multiplicity of movements came into being in the context. And so I leave my introductory remark there, this sort of to frame the context of our conversation and to see how we could discuss some of these ideas with our two really fantastic film curators, Mahan Buenetti and Keith Shiri. In some ways, what I would like to do here is precisely to see how we could potentially filter the experience of African cinema through precisely the lens of the curator. In other words, we know the filmmaker as a protagonist of African cinema, in some ways the actor as a protagonist of African cinema, but we haven't spoken enough of the curator as a protagonist of African cinema. I think this is one of our rare occasions to have really two world-class film curators with us who will help us maybe see how they position themselves in relation to some of these ideas that I put forward earlier. And of course, how in their own professional experiences, they try to come to grips precisely with these ideas in the process of making African cinema visible in Africa, in the diaspora, and really across the world. And so we have two, as I said, world-class film curators with us here. But so I'll start with Mahan Buenetti. So Mahan has been, sent me a bit of a long introduction here that I won't be able to summarize, unfortunately, but has been, in fact, is the founder of the New York African Film Festival and has been doing this work since the early 1990s. She has really worked in establishing, again, we're talking about Présence Africaine, an African cinematic presence in, of course, one of the biggest and most important metropolises on our planet, New York City, no less. And has been involved in the process of putting this festival together in a multiplicity number of initiatives, of course, showing films, of course, creating audiences, but also publishing, in fact, a set of documents, really priceless documents about interfaces between filmmakers and other interviewers to allow us to really get a sense of the African cinema project through their lenses. She's also been involved in various initiatives. I'm thinking of the Africa First initiative. I guess you maybe talk about it in her presentation. Which was one that really sought to, in fact, tutor or mentor, let's say, African filmmakers, emerging African filmmakers. A project between Focus Features at the time, Keisha Cameron and others. And really, when you look at the roster of people who came out of the Africa First experience, it's fantastic. We have now our most important filmmakers on the continent. Think of Rungano Nyoni, think of Diana Guy, think of Dauda Coulibaly, Wanuri Kayo, obviously, thank you very much.
And the young Shivji.
Exactly.
And Jeremiah.
Exactly. So really the new, let's say, locomotives of African cinema, so to speak. So Mahan in her presentation will obviously tell us about her experience as a curator and how she, I think that experience resonates with some of the idea that we put forward. So Keith Sheary is also a fantastic curator, as I said, who's worked both on the continent and around the world, really, who came into curation through the art historical, so to speak, and moved into cinema through his encounter with, Sanben and Googie, came to Ouagadougou to actually find out more about what African cinema was about, and he never left Ouagadougou, really. So he's been, obviously, he actually published a book called, I think he had a film festival called Africa in the Picture in London, published a book around African cinema, but more importantly, has really shaped both the perspectives and reception of African cinema intercontinentally, globally, let's put it that way. But also shaped generations of filmmakers. For example, one of the most striking aspects of his work for me had to do with his Nigerian experience. As you know, Nollywood came into being in the early 90s and is now, let's say, a major force in African cinema. But there was a sense that Nollywood did not really know about the legacy of Africa, of the rest of African cinema. And part of Keith's work has been to really put Nollywood in conversation with the Sisakos, the Semban, the Medhondos, and others. And within the context of a film festival called AFRIF, the Africa International Film Festival. And it seemed like a lost battle at some point because, sometimes he would show these films, the Nigerian film wouldn't show up, for example, But it looked like some people did show up. Some filmmakers showed up and said, well, okay, Nollywood is fine and good, but we would, even within the context of Nollywood, like to explore some of the things that the Sembans were trying to do, that some of the Sisakos are trying to do, and so on. And so we are having increasingly a new generation of Nigerian filmmakers who are moving toward that older tradition. And it's really to his credit. And I would like to add June also, because she was also involved in creating Nigeria in that context. So this is to briefly introduce her two speakers whom I'm really honored to share the stage with today. And so they each is going to have a 10 to 15 minute presentation, and following which we'll have a set of exchanges around their work more globally. So Mahan, would you like to start?
Of course. In your introduction, you speak of Presence African and place of Africa in the world, reimagining an Africa. And I mean, that was, for me, one of the reasons I was motivated to to find a safe space where myself and people like myself can convene and have an exchange, a discussion. But what were we going to discuss? So I will speak about my journey to starting the festival and landing in the United States. I'd lived in this country for many years, and in the 80s, knowing how Africa and Africans were perceived by the masses, especially through the nightly news, made this urgency even greater to find a way to dispel many of the misconceptions about the continent, her people. And indeed, that was a moment that, the continent was being ravaged once again. There was warfare, there was famine, there were despots, the Cold War was at its height. However, for me, I also observed that I was living in a space where you had, outside of Africa, the largest diaspora, the Americas, and all those communities. For me, I could find my footing in it because the culture was so similar, was so familiar, and so I wanted to find, a way to counteract those images on the nightly news. So that was the premises on which I started the festival. And I mean, I'm not a, let's say, curator. At that time, I was not. And so it was out of a frustration and urgency. And, I was also blessed to grow up at a time when I saw the transition from colonial rule to independence in my country, Sierra Leone. So I have this firsthand account of what, those pioneers, or you'd say those, ancestors of ours, this sort of Pan-African spirit, that drove them, that, sort of led them to create that collective and attain something. And of course, that was just a 10-year window, and that dream got deferred. So that's how I landed here. And, we were traumatized. It was a shock. But at the same time, it was something, there were many possibilities of regaining something, And I was fortunate also to meet a group of people who introduced me to many cultural references, including cinema. And that's where I discovered Usman Sembène, Safi Faye, Jibril Mambeti. And it was such a revelation. It gave me this opportunity to explore cultural forms, to, these artistic expressions that were on our own terms, was right there on the screen. And it just elated me, And I thought that was one of the light bulb moments for me. So I felt this was a way to probably, find a safe space, have a discussion going, projecting these images, and maybe trying to how would you say, the baton I had received from those ancestors, I'm going to run with it. I'm going to give my mark, leave my mark. And also you realize how powerful images are, discovering this body of work and knowing that no matter whether they were good or bad, we were telling our stories. And that for me was really just liberating. And so that is my journey to starting the organization. Getting there was another story, of course. You know, getting the support and convincing people, and that was, and it's still a challenge, but here we are 31 years later. So, I mean, and it's not only about me, it's about a collective that has made this happen, and that I'm really proud of. And the work keeps on coming, and there's so many different spaces where, you know, where the work is coming from or being made. And so that it's so rich. And we just have to do our bit, you know? Yeah. I think also, I would say the authenticity stems also from, you know, from the desire of the early African filmmakers. I am trying to continue that authenticity that they started, you know, and that is one of the ideas of the cinema. I guess that is why Usman Sembène made films. And I remember him saying, try to do your best to retain your independence. I maybe you shouldn't have listened to him, because but on the other hand, that gives us so much freedom. Yeah. And have I done my 10 minutes, or do I have more time?
Back.
You're mute, yeah.
We can come back, no problem. So thank you so
Okay.
much. Thank you so much for this really fantastic journey into, of course, the world of African cinema, and your own participation into the festival that you put together. I'm going to ask you to do the same, I suppose, at least to do this presentation, and then we'll start the conversation and sort of pulling out more threads out of the two presentations. So Keith, take it away.
Am I to speak?
Yes, you're on.
Oh, all right. Sorry. I mean, because your voice was going down. So.
Oh, sorry. Yes, you're on.
And thank you so much for inviting us to contribute to this. You know, I can never know what kind of the best points of entry in this conversation, because it is so important that we are rethinking and trying to reconfigure, you know, the moments of, if you like to call it, the birth of African cinema, and also looking back in all these kind of cultural experiences that came before it, before cinema, you know, which a lot of the continent continue to retain. And I'm, you know, I've always been an advocate for that, because I came from a background, being born, if I want to talk my journey, I was born in Zimbabwe. At the time, my country was called Rhodesia, and having to experience the idea of that space that was part of that regional, you know, with South Africa on the south, and then we were in that part of the world that you know, made us really kind of think differently, you know, kind of, you know, discarding everything there is about us as Africans, as Zimbabweans, you know, just to begin to, you know, to stay in a different world that was artificial in many ways. I've came to the United Kingdom in the late 70s, and my father at the time was in exile, and we and my brothers and sisters were kind of dispersed in different places in the United Kingdom, and then one you know, I went to a place, you know, it's called Gloucester, in the middle of nowhere. I thought Gloucester was in the middle of nowhere, and arrived at Heathrow Airport, spent one day in London, and the next day I was dispatched. I was dispatched, into Gloucester. That was cruel on the part of my father, because what I saw was just something extraordinary that was put in a most uncomfortable situation, that I had to begin again to rethink, to redefine myself in the most kind of that somehow, you're in a place that was the majority. We're talking about something else that was not particularly related to me. Until I came to London, and then I went to study film and television, just doing all these courses about film and photography. But the most important thing was that I was taught how to look at a painting. I remember, I think it was the National Gallery, this friend of mine who taught me how to look at paintings and then configure how that relates, and how you engage, how do you engage with this painting that you're looking at. But everything that I saw was just, I was experiencing my absence in everything that I saw. That was so overwhelming, coming from Rhodesia at the time, coming from a very kind of racist ideology that considered that Tarzan was the menu for Africans at the time, the kind of the menu of cinema, everything that we used to watch, my brothers, Basta Crave, the Westerns, everything else. And everything started coming into place when I came to London, to realize that it was just a kind of, this kind of a matrix of storytelling was about supremacy and domination. And then you are not part of the story. You refuse your central point of view. And then you just kind of like felt that you were drowning somewhere along the line. What about me in this kind of whole scripture of storytelling, whether it's from the religion, the Christianity, from cinema, from everything that you could see, that you say to yourself, well, what about me? What about the stories that my father, my grandfather, the stuff that we used to actually relate to when we were around the fireplace? What about me? And it became like a radical step for me to begin to disengage with everything there is about the Trafalgar Square or the British Museum and everything else. You have to disrupt and really begin again. It's in other words, clear the debris and start again. Clearing the debris, meaning that you have to actually sort of discard everything that you have learned in the past from everything else that has come in between, that has been subjected to you. In other words, like Ngugi wa Thiong'o would say something about, when he was talking about in his book on decolonizing the mind, how language played a big part in such a way that we began to assimilate ourselves in different ways, whether it is to do with the Sengo or Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe is going to take on something else. And then of course, we have this kind of way to actually sort of accept that, okay, let's use language. We can either, use it as a pidgin in English, and to assimilate ourselves and to retain the rhythm that requires a kind of, in intellect, how to survive, because you want to survive. We want to survive. We want to continue to survive. How do we survive on this planet? How do we define ourselves within those kind of slaughter and the violence that the colonial colonial legacy that it was, started in 1884 in Berlin. How do we survive all that? Because it was kind of the wrath of it. We still feel it, of course. And then, of course, coming when I joined the Africa Center, I got a job at the Africa Center, which is an organization which started in 1963, at the Euphoria of Independence, 1963, opened by Kenneth Kaunda at the time. It was one of the most important, and it still is one of the most important organizations that really was lobbying for kind of, it was a place where Africans could meet, in the United Kingdom at the time. It was a platform on which where you had James Baldwin, Chinua Achebe, and Dambudzo Marechera, Usman Semben, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. They passed through that organization. And of course, artists, painters, and, that I began to work with as a gallery administrator at the time. In 1987, I hosted a show by Malangatana Ngwenya, a Mozambican artist who I admired, and because he came from a movement of artists in Africa that were providing voices, like Diego Rivera in Mexico, like Frida Kahlo, the Mexican kind of movement of artists who were kind of working within a framework to engage to engage the peasantry in order to be able to kind of offer them voices to depict their kind of their societies. And I met Malangata Ngwenya, and and I had an exhibition with him in 1987. And of course, I was engaged in the galleries and Oshobo group of artists from Nigeria, for example, who remain one of the most crucial points of my reference if I want to talk about curating and thinking. Nigeria gave me so much, it's continued to give me as a country itself, which has not been actually sort of been able to be offered this kind of possibility to kind of transform from that kind of oral tradition to the visual arts, to grammar, to music, of course. We have the Fela Kuti who came and disrupted everything that he might have learned is jazz in the United Kingdom, and create his own way of actually sort of like talking about the conditions of his country. And so cinema kind of became a very important vehicle for me, because I also met Lionel Gakane, and then is that Lionel Gakane, he filmmaker from South Africa, from represent ANC, and Reketla Tselani from the APAC. They used to come to the Africa Center and really kind of having this kind of engaging arguments and discourses about the future of South Africa, and in a different way. But they're also filmmakers and artists. And I found that kind of the role they were playing and the kind of the argument, their discussion was so kind of rich. Their rhetoric was so rich for me. In other words, that there was something that they were saying how important audiovisual language is for the liberation of the people, for everyone else who mattered. And then of course, I remember going to Holland, to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam. That's the first time I actually met, the late Idrissa Ouedraogo at a festival there. And then Idrissa Ouedraogo in 1987, that was after Thomas Sankara had died. And we just kind of happened to sit next to him. He started talking to me about cinema, about Thomas Sankara, about FESPACO. And then of course, the following, 2 years later, 1989, I went to FESPACO, and that's the first time I met you, Abubakar, and most other people, 1989. I never ever missed a FESPACO since 1989, and I think that has always been my journey. But what as a programmer, I'm a programmer at the BFI. I've been programming African films at the BFI, British Film Institute, London Film Festival since I think since the 90s. I can't remember the exact date, but I continue to do that as a programmer, not as a curator. that as a curator, my journey started when I went to Zimbabwe, given that, sort of given an understanding where I came from and knowing the kind of agency of about cinema in that part of the world. Zimbabwe was one of the kind of the in the front line, in the front line, was the leader of the frontline states. And there was the first frontline film festival that started in 1990. It was so important to actually sort of engage cinema in that way. One of the leadership in Southern Africa was Samora Machel. Samora Machel introduced the idea of the documentary in Mozambique, and to such a way that, sort of there are two leaders that I really, Samora Machel in Mozambique and Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. They were so much in tune about what cinema ought to do as a kind of how important is the instrument for liberation, for kind of to engage people to use cinema as a vehicle for their freedom or to articulate themselves in a way that really, for me, matters a lot more. So I had the privilege to meet Usman Samban, to Lionel Ngakane, and everyone else. So I continue to do what I do. And of course, we're talking now.
Sorry to interrupt. 2 minutes, roughly.
Yeah, 2 minutes. Okay. So, in 2011, Sharjah Biennale, I did something called the idea of independence. We were talking about Daouda Coulibaly and others. There was a program that is kind of plot for the Biennale in 2011. One of my colleagues, Rasha Salti, I was in Beirut at the time. She was talking to me about the Sharjah, and I've been there. I came there in 2011, and of course that developed a lot of other kind of ideas that are still kind of running around my the work that I do. So I don't have a kind of one specific place I wish I had, but I'm just everywhere, but also because it's always kind of, I'm driven by the necessity of kind of progressing all the discussion that was started by the pioneers of African cinema.
All right, well, thank you so much, both of you. It was really enlightening to learn about your respective itineraries and coming into that world of African cinema. Both itineraries, in fact, partaking in, one could argue, either the failure of the decolonization process or the incompleteness of the decolonization process in the case of Mahan, because it was really coming in a kind of exile as a result of things not working out exactly as they should have in the aftermath of decolonization. And in the case of Keith, it's an actual context of decolonization, because Rhodesia was still a colony and wouldn't really access its independence as Zimbabwe until 1980, really. And so I thought we should go back again and discuss how now these itineraries that you plotted out resonate with the discussion that we have here. And so I'd like to ask you a number of questions. One would be, how would you situate yourselves in the longue durée, that is the expanded time of African cinema history, theory and aesthetics? What do you see the role and place of curation to be in that history? What do you see? I'm gonna just list maybe 2 or 3 and then you can take it from here. For example, what do you see the relation between the curator and the filmmaker to be? I think Keith has already alluded to some of it. Mahan has also alluded to some of it, but if you want to really expand on that a little bit. You've also talked about some of the institutions. You've talked about FESPACO, the Africa Center, etc. So your relationship to these film institutions, how are they useful to you in the kind of work you do? And how do you think your work actually may or may not impact what they try to do? And more globally, what do you think the role of the curator is in the transformation of African film practice?
You're asking me?
Both of you.
Um, well, I mean, I'll be very happy to. I mean, I think that people always ask you, ask what is different between a programmer and a curator. And as a programmer, I work, with a lot of festivals where I'm asked to program their thematic ideas. So you come in and then you put yourself into that place. So you just put yourself in a place, whether it is Venice, whether it's Berlin, whether it is. So you kind of work around their thematic ideas, but it would have been thought through before you are in place. So you are kind of programming somebody else's kind of ideas about what from a thematic, from a curatorial positioning is that, because all these things that I've been struggling with about myself, my identity, my role, my migration, everything else, I'm always questioning them as I go about my life, and of course engaging with artists and filmmakers and other, so that I'm able to rethink how do I kind of like positioning all my thoughts, and then in my conversation, in a place that can, continue or really kind of respect the kind of the other direction that most of us think about, because it's nothing is it is quite clear that so there are not enough curators of God, sorry, sorry, there are not enough curators on who curates from the African perspective. If somebody else would say to me, I've seen so much work about, they mean well, like the do-gooders who parachute in a continent and come out with some kind of airport art and then put it somewhere in Oxford or whatever they are, and decide that what it means. It might mean something to some people, but it does not really engage in a way that it ought to be in such, from the depth of where we are so weak. We're so weak that our ministries of cultures and our kind of space, our institutions, the continent are non-existent because they were kind of taken out. In recent years, when I saw the first time when this war against Iraq, when I saw the first thing they did was actually sort of like go for that museum in Iraq, because it's a museum of memory. And I think if the world actually you have to weep, in order to understand what it means. The first thing that you need to understand is that when you want to dominate people, take away their language, take away their culture, and then you actually sort of like put some scientific kind of, inside them, and then they begin to behave that way. So as a curator, I know exactly what this game is all about. The game is that to not understand, for people to not have this kind of ownership of their nomenclature of the work that has happened for centuries. It's like, for example, if you want to go to learn about anything, about whatever you want, you don't go to Ghana to be able to understand about the Kente cloth. You have to come to United Kingdom. I mean, that's a thing that in my mindset, because it was so important. If you go to British Museum, British Library, everywhere else, they have masses and masses of collection of everything there is about that really is about the continent itself. It was so important. So to be able to kind of like go through that, go through the kind of gates, the gatekeepers of British Museum. For example, when I was trying to do Zimbabwean stone sculptures, it's my country. I was born in Zimbabwe. I know exactly what it is that need to be said, because what it is in the museums and some kind of contemporary galleries is not actually exactly what it's supposed to be saying, because each art, every sculpture, everything, when an artist spends years to actually give you something, it says something, you know. I remember reading something like to say that Africans don't understand abstract art, you know, but Africans are always doing absolutely the fact that you simplify it when it comes to Europe. It's a matter of concern. It's not only because, you know, when Semben did the film Mandabi, when he actually had to fight for anybody to actually decide that, you know, so I need to have my own form about the film, you know, because it was not kind of, you know, it was not particularly in a place that the French would understand, but because this is when you know, as a curator, you have to understand all the symbols of the light and the I don't know, I mean, to just kind of put in more of the ownership of whatever we put together, and it always continues to be a huge challenge for me in the spaces that we have always been creating, because we tend to assimilate very quickly the continent itself. Now, look, one of the things that I've always said that, you know, when you see you know, Medondos, so they, I mean, it's kind of like, for me, it's a cry for you know, to say of resistance. You resist the domination, you resist everything else, including, of course, Kamche Roy. I mean, when you see the kind of when Siddiq Bakaba, who actually I met quite recently in Facebook, you know, putting his hand on that kind of whatever his thoughts were against the barbed wire, and in his kind of experience, you recognize that something has been taken away from you that is not actually sort of what people think that it should be. You know, they force you to do something else, but the reality is it's still in you. You can't get that is me, you know, however you want to represent me in a different way. It's like Sheikh Anta Diop would say, you can cut my hand because you're stronger than me, but you cannot tell me that I was born with one hand. I mean, that's when you actually begin to, you know, as a curator, start, how do I put everything together to be able to actually put the arm back in its place and have the ownership of my narrative, you know? The grammar itself is quite important. It's absolutely important and necessary. Academics and all these things, they copy and paste everything they have already, because they are kind of so powerful. You can't be part of that discourse, because they have already done their bid in order to kind of characterize a whole continent. For me, Algiers, the kind of what happened in 1969 was quite equally very, very important. It actually was a kind of conversation which people don't understand. When I something written, and I think it was quite important when Amical Cabral said at a press conference in Algiers, he says, pick a pen and take note. The Muslims make the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Christians to the Vatican, the national liberation movements go to Algiers. It was, for me, it's quite interesting. I mean, it is really, you know, as a point of reference, the continent had enough, you know. Algeria started to actually start a conversation which we ought to, I mean, I'm very embarrassed that we have not actually taken cue from what those guys started those many years ago in 1969, when people were going to the moon and everything else, something else was happening in Africa, in the continent. It was very serious in many ways. So you have to kind of like regroup and then clear the debris and try to figure out how to create a jigsaw puzzle that can make a meaning to people, because those things are part of history. These are part of our history, and then we ignore them to our own detriment. I don't think that most of the creatives, young people, remember all these things, the kind of the conversation that even started from Dakar in Algiers or Festac 77, you know? Going to Nigeria again, I mean, going to Lagos, talking about what you introduced before about Nollywood. You know, I mean, when we went to do city to city, when I visit, because I've been working in Lagos, understanding what these creators are doing, it's quite important to celebrate the kind of achievements you know, of these Nigerian filmmakers and what they've achieved without any dependence from somewhere else. They're creating some kind of audiovisual kind of entertainment, you know. But for me, it's not cinema. It's something else. And I do hope that one day it's going to come from with the cinema. It would have to come within a space that comes from the thinking of the Ben Okris, the Queen 77, and everyone else, the Fela Kutis. And because Nigeria can afford to do that, I'm still patient to actually understand, we have to celebrate what the so-called Nollywood is about. Wale Soyinka does not even like to this word Nollywood. It seems to me you're giving up. You want to assimilate yourself, even calling it Wood Nollywood. But nevertheless, Nigeria seems to me kind of offering kind of a future of kind of independent creatives kind of coming up and then doing something interesting. So as a curator, you really need to be able to understand the whole continent from Algeria to Zimbabwe, A to Z, and understanding its dynamics.
Thank you. I'll stop you there to allow also June to be able to answer the question. And I'm going to put him, if you don't mind taking notes, I'm going to put these because I would like to also add some questions from the audience. June, yes, you want to say something? Hey, sorry, sorry, do you want to say something?
No, I was going to say, as a film programmer and curator, I think we wear both hats. Yeah. As the film programmer, I'm the active participant in many aspects of, my job is to connect all the stakeholders, the producers, the directors, the distributors, and the audiences. And as a curator, I'm providing context. And, I'm weaving that story. So I asked the question, where's the common thread? How do I connect all of us? Where's the human dimension? How is this film relatable? What moves people positively or negatively? And can this film travel? So we're putting our finger, on a common pulse. Because here in this space where we operate, you have, as I said, there's a wide diaspora. So you're bringing so many people together, from the cinephile to the person who is just a Sunday, moviegoer, to the student, to the one who wants to learn, who wants to find that space where they can come and validate themselves, get that information, that counteracts what they hear on the nightly news. And so I think that has also been, and we really work hard to maintain this authenticity and quality of programming, because it's not only showing films, it's also the space in which you provide this manifestation, how one enters that space, what happens there, and what happens when they leave. And that was, and I feel you also are building a trust, and also the loyalty comes from that. And, just seeing people leave the theater and wanting to agree to disagree, or asking, where can I get the music? How can I read more about this filmmaker? Where can I find that information? And that was what motivated us to actually do the publications, because we wanted it was like direct cinema. The filmmaker is speaking directly to the person, to the audience member. And so many people wanted to see this organization succeed. And that's why I say it's about a collective. And I remember, God bless him, but Sembed, no matter, though he's one of those, I call him our queen, because but he always said, retain your independence. And when Keith is speaking of Nigerian cinema, he actually respected what they were doing. He did not, whereas you find others who dismissed it, he thought, that's a homegrown industry. He says, whether you like it or not, this is something that is going to give us a template. And indeed, he was correct, because every other country on the continent has used that model to jumpstart their own industry. And I remember in when we first formed the organization, for me, it was critically important that the people whose stories are being told were participating in the process. So we reached out first to our communities. I employed that method of when you knock on the gate of the chief's compound and he or she welcomes you, you tell them your story, why you're here, and then he or she calls their people and tells them what you're about, and they come out to support you. And that was very important because prior to that, I would go, we started with like American cinema started from the silent to the talkies, to the popular, to the art house. We went the reverse direction. We went from art house, and now we're making it accessible to everyone. And I wanted to make sure that the people whose stories were being told were participating and were invited and felt welcome. And so that was why when we launched actually the flagship program in 1993, prior to that, of course, we're just sort of, wetting our community, letting them know, galvanizing them so they can come out and support us. So we did all these little community programs, and that was, it was unheard of. It had never been seen in 1993, where an African, program at Lincoln Center and Brooklyn Museum at the time would take place, and you would over 70% of the audience are people of color. That was amazing. Yeah. But and scary at the same time, because how do you top that? And Semben was here, and there's this photo of him in this room that is crowded. Him, Jonathan Demme, Gordon Parks, I think Jane Cortez, all hanging heads. It's like the hunters and huntresses, just having a conversation in this crowd. It's a beautiful image. And one of the people, as I said, there were some people, of course, we had our detractors, but in general, there was a lot of goodwill for this organization. And one of the people I want to really mention here, and I'll be remiss if I don't, is William Greaves. He was exceptional because he told me, in fact, he introduced us to he was the one who gave us the tip about the Russian archives. Because this man walked us over to meet Gordon Parks to get his support, and he became a board member. And he took us to Washington, he just opened so many doors for us. And because for him, going to Africa in 1966 to attend the First World Festival of Negro Arts totally transformed his life. And he said he came there, the USAID gave him this money to just do recordings, but he just sensed that moment was so important. So he took that money and bought a very inexpensive camera, like a toy camera, he said. And he lands on the earth of Dakar, and there's everyone there, and the Russians, who had a state of the art, like a tanker, and they were there for a month. And he says, find those films they made. And that was that was our entry and and meanwhile, Keith actually had introduced us simultaneously to a woman who also, because I had other people telling us, find what the British also did. And that was because in 2007, we wanted to juxtaposition our storytelling, our cinema, with what the colonial cinema was, in celebration of the 50th anniversary of our first Black independent nation, Ghana. And so that was the quest to you know, to also add another layer, a nuance to all this common thread, this storytelling. And prior to that, I was also in 2000, in fact, June was here, where all these women, you know, showed up in New York, and Miriam Makeba was our guest of honor. And because as we all spoke about, you know, it's the stories go through every discipline, every medium, literature, you know, theater, fashion, and then of course the cinema. And so she was here, and she, of course, is multifaceted. She's not only a singer, she's an actress, she's an activist, or she was rather. And we had her as guest of honor, and she did a concert, and there were all these women on stage, and including Angelique Kidjo, who had a concert here in New York last night, by the way. And so there are moments, there are highlights, you know, where we try to bring along our collective, and we're all really sort of shedding and reimagining and empowering ourselves through this collective. So I mean, there are many more moments, I would say, but yeah, this is, I'm thinking of next week also, of another moment that I have to create. And whilst I'm speaking to you. So this is, just having this conversation is so refreshing, because it also empowers me, gives me courage, you know, to continue, because it's not easy. I mean, woman, Black, African, New York. But I don't think about those things, because I just feel that there is a space for us, because we are giving so much to humanity. And yes, there's that other side where we are traumatized and doing all these things to ourselves. But if you say culture feeds the soul, Africa is the continent that just keeps on giving, you know? And I want us to also realize this is something that we have offered the world, you know? But let's use that also to heal ourselves. Let's find our commonality. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful testimony. And so I have my own question, but I'd like to also read some questions from the audience. So if you don't mind taking notes, I'm just gonna read them all, at least some of them, and you can sort of respond to them accordingly. Okay. One is, can you elaborate on your understanding of decolonization? What does it mean to you, that concept, after African countries achieved flag/political independence? How long would it take to decolonize? Correcting the wrongs of the West is intellectually fraught. What if the impetus to empower Africa is incomplete? Anyway, so I think the first half is sufficient. Second question, if you don't mind taking notes, so you'll come back to it. What are the instruments we have put in place to help us realize our goal of documenting our history of decolonizing our minds? What are the connecting links? Another, I think, a follow-up to the decolonization. Do you think decolonization is a process that film festivals have engaged in? That's one. There's a question about Tunisia, about Tahar Sharia. So I'm from Tunisia, and where the first Pan-African film festival was founded, the Carthage Film Festival by Tahar Sharia. Along with Semben Mambeti and other Sharia struggle was to decolonize African cinema and to emancipate our screen. So far, we have not mentioned Tahar Sharia, who was a close friend of Semben. So have you heard of Tahar Sharia, and what's your response to that question? So these are some of the initial ones.
Okay, can I also, talking about Taha Sharia, and,
yes.
and I'm so sorry, because I'll say to you that this requires a lot of kind of time for us to begin to engage properly. And the first time, in fact, that I was, given a permit to go to the Baobab, as we called it in Burkina Faso, in Fespaco, I was introduced to Taha Sharia because Taha Sharia was one of the close friends with Usman Samban, Lionel Gakane, and Timitus Suri and others. They had a little place that we imagine was a baobab in a Hotel Independence in Mogadishu. And of course, you know, we all know how, you know, he founded the festival that just actually it's taking place right now as we speak. And
Right.
one of the most important, significant festivals in our continent. And he's always honored, and in his work, I know about, most of us know about that festival through Taha Sharia. And then I think that he actually is one of the most significant figures as founding fathers of our continental festivals, if you like. So, you know, there's no doubt about that. He was one of the most important people who, and Usman Semben, Taha Sharia, and others, and Lion Gakane, who started this kind of imagining kind of a continent that ought to have to celebrate its own cinemas and recognizing the, you know, what we now have, as I say, it continues. I mean, FESPACO was just a couple of weeks ago, and now we've got Qatar. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, the calendar just been disturbed a little bit. But no, I mean, he remains one of the most important people in the idea of the satellite of the continent about the beginnings of it. Don't forget, these people were very young in the 60s, and the energy that they brought to the fore was the understanding the what cinema can do is against the onslaught of Hollywood, against the onslaught of everything else whether coming from Europe. And of course, there was also that kind of possibilities that happened. They were working within that kind of context, Taha, Sharia, Samben, Usman, and others, within the, you know, creating this, you know, to be part of the so-called, you know, third cinema. It was quite important to understand that they were not only looking from the perspective as a commercial, cinema as a commercial entity as it's now has become. They were thinking through its kind of cultural positioning itself in the cultural space, and having survived and having to look about the audiovisual aggression of Hollywood. You know, I mean, Hollywood was its aggressive kind of like its tentacles going everywhere. And we all kind of, I'm sure that most of us, everyone who is on this platform, I always think that I've been to New York. Or before I went to New York, I thought that I'd been because of the idea, how the image of Hollywood is always offered to you about United States of America. And because it was that important, the importance of that. What I'm saying about this, that there were people, men like Taha Sharia, Usman Samban, who decided to actually focus and understanding that how important, how powerful the tool filmmaking is all about. I'll read you something very quite briefly. Last time Usman Samban came to London, he was being given a BFI fellowship. And then he was being interviewed by Bonnie Greer, writer, American writer. She's here. She asked him about, I mean, the first question she asked about heroism of daily life. And again, you know, it reminded me about, you know, if you question is that kind of got people like Usman Samban to make films, it's like coming from in a different space that inspires other people, like whether you talk about the Italian neo-realists or you talk about the fact that the guy, Usman Samban, was trade unionist, and then he was kind of, so his empathy on, you know, these people was quite remarkable. And he said, we are, so Benny Gray said, she said, Molade is the second film in a trilogy and you call it trilogy about heroism of daily life. Could you expand on that, please? And Semben says, we're talking here about the African continent, and it is a continent going through a crisis. Nobody can deny that. We have a lot of wars going on, brothers killing brothers. We have a lot of diseases and catastrophes. But on the other hand, we have a majority of individuals, both men and women, who are struggling on a daily basis in a heroic way, and the outcome of whose struggle leaves no doubt. This is a struggle whose purpose is not to seize power. And I think the strength of our entire society rests on that struggle. And it is because of this struggle that the entire continent is still standing up. So I've tried in my own way to sing the praises of those heroes, because I'm also a witness to that daily struggle. In the traditional society which I come from, when you look at our societies, whether you are talking about the Mandinka, Bambara, or Fulani, we have the tradition of the storyteller called the griot, and also other kinds of storytellers. Their role was to record memories of daily action and events. At night, people would gather around them and they would tell those stories that they had recorded. I think there are parallels between myself and these storytellers, because in that tradition, in that traditional society, the storyteller was his own writer, director, actor, and musician. And I think that this role was very important in cementing society. Now with new technology tools that we have acquired, I think we can take inspiration from them and do some work. And that, for me, it summarizes everything that I've known about this man. And of course, you know, it's like, on your mask, get set and go. African cinema was late, you know, into kind of, given that if you talk about the history of cinema, you know, from 1895, the Lumiere brothers and the African cinema started in the 60s. On your marks, and these guys, young as they were, they decided to actually, so really, it became a political act, you know, not only because there's a political act, but it became like a subversive act. You have to understand the kind of difference between kind of the militancy, how cinema was started in the continent was by these young men and women who decided to start and embrace cinema as a kind of a subversive act, you know, and following through the other kind of filmmakers from South America, if you like. And for me, it's still there. I mean, I think you know there are chapters, and of course there are kind of filmmakers who are kind of coming up with the you know, like for example Jeremiah Lemang Moses from Lesotho is coming completely very kind of interesting grammar about his cinema. You know, if you talk about the now, the moment is that language, that drama, that kind of ownership of the aesthetic, you know, the ownership of the aesthetic, the African grammar, the African vocabulary, if you like, and everything else. It's set as an example of what these people are trying to do at this moment.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I'd like to let Mahan answer as well. We have only very few minutes left, really 4 minutes.
Well, I also, speaking of Sharia, Mohammed Shalouf has done a beautiful, you know, portrait of this man. So that's a film that, you know, whoever asked whether we knew of this Sharia, we do know. And he used to come to Fespaco too. There was that corner where he, Semben, and Lionel will sit, and, you know, dare you go there if you were not invited. But and it was just very interesting. They saw everything going on, you know, and you could just imagine the conversations. And yeah, Carthage, Tunisia, I mean, you know, when we were in Fespaco just a week ago, and I was just thinking, how do you, with its incredible Burkina Faso, this very rich culture, and Mali's next door, Niger's next door, Ghana is down there. And I was thinking, all these demarcations we didn't create, we're really the same people. And I want to start reimagining our continent in another way, you know, and just like take away these like, I mean, in Sierra Leone, half of my people are across the river here in Liberia, half across in Guinea, but we're the same people. So we could start with that, just reimagining, you know, basically, you know, the hunter-gatherer walking through the plains, going from one place to the other, and not having these demarcations, but rather a great civilization of how to exist and how to respect the environment as well, because they had to coexist. And so for me also, I think the question was about how do we decolonize? What was the question again?
What's your understanding of decolonization, if my memory is correct? What's your understanding? What does it mean to you, this concept, after African countries have achieved flag independence? And how long would it take to decolonize, essentially?
I think it's always ongoing because we're always, you know, the slaughter is on, always, even now, but it's cloaked in another way. I mean, I am doing this work from the example I saw of my parents who had colonial education, but who fought for our independence, who equally thought colonial education was as important as their traditional education. So you saw that resistance from then on, you know, and that struggle. So that's what informs who I am. And I mean, I feel that it's really up to us as a people, if we can just, I am doing this work to heal us, for us to have a conversation and not spend so much energy. Yes, we know it exists, but it's exhausting to always look at someone else's validation of who I am. I am looking at us, empowering us, and that will always exist. But strength in numbers, and if you can shed a lot of this trauma and, you know, empower yourself by owning your stories, and that moving image is so, the immediacy of it, you know, Sembeno always says there's an urgency. It's like night school, you know, we're catching up, you know, it's a way for us to reconnect. And so for me, that is, I'm more focused on, yes, okay, we're decolonizing ourselves, but that is like the conversation amongst ourselves and looking at what we can shed, yes, and not necessarily always having this reference or validation from someone else.
I think that for me, that's why your festival is so crucial. I mean, how you've been very consistently over a number of years to a point where there's no such a festival in this planet where you have the director of the festival invite people to her or his own house and cook the meals and have that kind of really and continuous relationship with the people. And then it's no longer kind of like you have immersed yourself in the work that you've been doing over the years, Mahan. And I think that it's not me just saying that, but a lot of filmmakers and the people that we spoke about either through Africa First, even Usman Samband and all the people that we do know. And then it's kind of it becomes like a personal thing. You are no longer kind of like doing it as a job, but you are really kind of feeling you're immersing yourself into this kind of this journey that you have taken. I always valued you, Mahan, about your commitment to that.
Likewise.
In the kind of the environment that you work and where just kind of not only talk about politics about Africa, but also the Black kind of reaction to the work that you do about Africa. And this is, for me, it's so important, more even urgent, in that part of the world.
Likewise, you. I mean, it's a collective. you know, we're all, this is what is beautiful also about us all checking in with each other when we go to FESPACO. This heirloom we've inherited that, you know, maybe never tells the correct time, but it's part of our legacy. And despite that, we make things happen. I'm still sort of remembering moments of being in Waga, and it really energizes us. It's like renewing your cells, you know, and coming back and having to deal. You can do it until you meet again. Yeah.
Excellent. That is, in fact, one of the functions of film festival, to renew the energies of the participants in order to go back to the
Yeah.
battlefield, so to speak. And so, I mean, there's obviously more questions that were asked. I don't know if the Sharjah Institute group is open to us taking one or two.
No,
Or if-
Abu Bakr, I
Yes.
want to thank you very much. And I want to thank both Keith Shiri and Mahan Buenetti for engaging in this discussion by way of their own personal experiences, their ongoing work, and in fact, charting that trajectory. You know, I think an important point was made about the difference between a programmer and a curator. In addition to coming into being someone who is concerned with, as Mahan said, linking producers, filmmakers, and audiences. I think this is a very significant point to make in terms of the focus of this discussion and in relation to what has been said in the last 2 weeks and what we will probably conclude with in the final session. The underlying factor here is, I think, from the discussion, the incompletion or the incompleteness of Africa's decolonization. And in fact, cinema's importance and the inability and the impossibility of the curator, for example, the programmer, not working in relation to that history and that challenge or the challenges of that history. Hence the notion of positioning African cinema as a definitive concept, as a political act. I don't think it means that every film has to be, let's say, a political film in its, rhetorical form or what it actually says. But indeed, the act of representing oneself, the act of engaging with audiences, the act of making these images and involving in this debate becomes part of that political act. In conclusion, I want to just reinforce that around the convergence and the common ground that we will find between Nollywood and its future and the aspirations of Semben and his generation. Semben Tahasheria, that pioneer generation, not only their intentions, but their understanding historically of what Nollywood meant and does mean and can mean for the future of African cinema as a whole. And on that note, I would hope that that draws together the sort of overall perspective of the discussion. And we will reflect on what's been on for the last few weeks and what will take place in the coming final session. Just before I hand over to June Giovanni, who joined us, is that there's been one or two questions about viewing films on the website. They're all through the links on the website. But as I noted to one or two inquiries, you may not find, for example, a film like Solelo, because we've had to make a few revisions due to rights issues, etc. And of course, the films for each week are only on for a brief window during that week. So we hope people will take the opportunity to view the films during the weeks leading up to the discussion itself. And of course, along with the recommended viewing, they will be able to pursue further viewing or repeated viewing in the near future. Thank you. June, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Imru. In fact, I've mentioned most of my comments about this discussion within the chat. I've responded to a couple of comments that people have made, because I think the whole idea of decolonizing is one that is quite complex. And I do think also that it's one that challenges the notion of the role of the colonial within that. And it's one of the things that I think that in terms of how we look at decolonizing and what decolonizing is, needs to happen, because it actually takes us back. In fact, we should be taken back to look at what happened before the colonial, and not be continually looking at since the colonial to now. I think it's knowledge of, and that's what we need to share with audiences and with through film and through cinema, is to give people a wider perspective of where their knowledge and their understanding of culture, and also to encourage filmmakers and people putting work out there to actually engage as much with the pre-colonial as with the colonial, as with the post-colonial experience. So that's, I think, the colonial is the aspect that we do need to challenge and to discuss and to look at as we move forward in this idea of decolonizing. I think as you said, Imru, we're moving on to look at in the final symposium, which will take place on the 19th of November. That symposium will focus on continuity and change, and it will actually draw together a lot of the discussion that we've had in these first three seminars. And the details, of course, of that will be found on the website. We thank all of our participants today. We thank all of you who have been attending both this and the others, and we hope that you'll be with us again in 2 weeks' time when we complete this series with the Continuity and Change webinar. And yes, we thank our partners, the Africa Institute, and yeah, we look forward to taking this further and to rounding up with some of the outcomes from these webinars. So thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
June.
you.
Thank you, June.
Thank you,
Thank you, June, Imru,
Yeah.
Abubakar,
Yeah.
Hatan,
you.
Mahan, Keith, Abubakar,
and Keith, yeah.
Imru,
Okay.
Satan, and
Yeah.
Reem, especially. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you all very much. I'd just like to answer one question from that just came in the Q&A. Yes, last week's recording webinars of the webinar session will be available this week. We just needed some time to edit and put it up. And we will see you again on November 19th, as Drew mentioned. We will just skip 1 week for the final session. Thank you all, and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon.
All right. Thank you so much, Santi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.